Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Education Writers Association for this webinar on a new data tool revealing disparities in school level spending. I'm Lori Crouch, EWA's Assistant Director. Today, we're joined by Marguerite Rosa, Director of the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown University, and Daryl Burnett, Assistant Managing Editor at Education Week. I'm pleased to introduce today's moderator, Chastity Pratt, Education Editor at the Wall Street Journal, to get us started on this conversation. Take it away, Chastity.
Thank you, Lori, and hello, education writers. You're in for a treat today. We're going to have a very good discussion with some experts on education finance. As Lori said, we have Daryl Burnett here with us. Not only is he with Education Week, but he previously served as the Bureau Chief of Chalk Beat, Tennessee, and worked as an education reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and the Louisville Courier-Journal. Also, again, and as Lori said, we have Dr. Marguerite Rosa with us, research professor at Georgetown University and the director of Edunomics Lab. That's a research center exploring and modeling complex education finance decisions to inform policy and practice. And Professor Rosa is the author of the highly regarded education finance book, Educational Economics: Where Do School Funds Go? It's going to be a vibrant educational conversation. So thank you everyone for joining us. And I'm going to ask Dr. Rosa to start us off. If you could walk us through the NERD database and how journalists can use it now and how we'll be able to use it and manipulate the data for our own stories in the future. Take it away, Professor Rosa.
Yes, happy to. So if I could get the screen share, I will show some slides here. So we have a new database, and it's we've named it NERDS because, well, that's what we are, I guess. The National Ed Resource Database on Schools, and it's really school spending data. And believe it or not, that's a relatively new thing in K-12 data. So I'm going to walk you through what that means. But first of all, 5 years ago, we passed ESSA, which is a federal law, and tucked away in this federal education law was something that we thought was jaw-dropping, super exciting, and that was the requirement that states report spending by school. And the reason we put this cute picture of this girl up there was because we never had that information before. We knew how much districts got, but not schools, and that was really a game changer. So let me explain why it matters. The data, by the way, have just started to roll out. Took 5 years for states to comply with this. The deadline was June, this last June. Almost every state has now reported the data, with the exception of Pennsylvania. But let me explain what it is. So federal, state, and local money all land on the district. And we have a lot of information about district spending, but when it gets to the district, that money gets divided up by district leaders and sent to schools. And over the years, we had gobs and gobs of information about how much money went to each district, but that was it. After it got to the district, we didn't know how much each school got. And that's what makes this information so much different, is that we didn't know how much each school got. And it turns out districts make a lot of decisions that impact whether or not one school gets more money or less money than the others. So the school by school data are really going to highlight the district's role in allocating funds across schools. And we ask people this all the time. So who's the one who decides how to spend all the money in public education? And they say things like Secretary Cardona or my governor or the legislature, and they're wrong. It's actually the school board together with the district leaders. So the other groups might be the ones that decide how much money the district gets, but then how to spend it tends to be a district decision. And remember, we got this new chunk of money. So these are all the different acronyms that the federal government gave their federal funds: ARP or CRSA or CARES. You might also have seen ESSER, that's the education portion of that. But a big chunk of new money is landing on districts, and that too is coming in, that's federal dollars. And once again, it will be districts' decision on how to divide that up across schools. And if a district has 10 schools or 20 schools, those decisions will really be impactful in deciding how that money goes out. So this is the first time we're really going to have it. We're going to be able to track this money. By the way, notice that we named our database NERDS, which at least you can remember, compared to these federal acronyms, which I think they have a little work to do, but that's just another topic. Okay, so we've had outcomes by schools for years. We knew which schools were higher performing and which ones were lower. But what's new now is the spending side of that. We didn't know if a low performing school was a low performing school that was also financially shortchanged, or if it was a low performing school that had many more dollars than its peers. Those seem to be two different things in my opinion. So I'm just going to give you a couple of glimpses of the data, and I apologize in advance because I'm a data person, I love data, and it'll be your job to translate it into words, but here is the school spending on a district. This is a larger district. These are all of the elementary schools in the district. And what you can see is that the schools over to the right are getting more money than the schools to the left. And that's wholly a district decision here. So the difference between them is over $4,000 per student. So some schools are getting quite a bit more money. The light yellow here is the federal dollars. The dark yellow is the state and local. But there's a real big spread. And if you dig into this particular district, you can see that two of these schools way up near the top are relatively affluent student populations. So they have fewer than 25 or 27% kids in poverty. Free reduced lunch is poverty. So these are more affluent schools. And on the other end of the spectrum, we see two schools with very high poverty levels. So just taking stock of what happened here. The district got a bunch of money and chose through all sorts of policy decisions that it made at the district level to give more of that money on a per pupil basis to its more affluent schools and less of that money by a lot to at least these schools over here on the left. So extra points for you if you can figure out which one this is. You're welcome to write the story about it. There's examples of these all over. They're not always telling the same story. Sometimes, but they always have a story to tell. Sometimes you see districts where they're spending a lot on their magnet school or their small schools, or they're spending way more on the high school than the elementary, or maybe they're spending way more on the elementary than the high school, or the schools on the north side of town, or they're spending more on the schools that have a science program or under-enrolled schools or whatever it is. But they always have a story to tell, and mostly we find that even the leaders in the district haven't looked at the numbers and don't know that story. So if you like data, we do this all the time. We use scatter plots and other kinds of things. This is a different one where we've lined up the spending for all the schools in the state that are high poverty elementary schools. They're all high poverty elementary schools compared to the outcomes. And you can see that you have a school over here that has stronger outcomes, but it's expensive. It's an expensive school. A school over here is also expensive, but it's low outcomes. Compare that with this one. This is a lower cost school, but it's getting really high outcomes, especially among its peers. Or down here, and this is a school that has very few dollars and also has low outcomes. And we should write about these four schools differently. And that's what these data can do here. So we're excited about this new NERDS database. It's getting better over time. We just released our first version of it, but that's where all the data can be found. And because we've had some generous grants by foundations, we're offering a $5,000 mini grant for any analysis using NERDS. You have to apply, it's competitive, but journalists are encouraged to apply. It's a very short application. This is not some federal application. It's due April 30th, although if you have an idea, you can submit, we would suggest you submit it earlier because we'll be talking to our funders about potentially expanding this grant opportunity, and you can get that at our website. And I have a list here of story ideas. which schools spend the most or the least per student? Do students of color or low-income families get a fair share? What about small schools? Are they getting more or less? What about school spending across region? What about uneven teacher salaries? That's another issue that we watch. Sometimes all the senior teachers congregate on one side of town and they are drawing down disproportionately more money, which means that the district's spending more in those schools. How much money is centrally managed? Are there any, well, and of course, this big one, which schools are getting more federal money, which we will absolutely be able to see. So I thought I would end here with just a bit of information on our certificate program, because if you're interested in doing more reporting on finance, we've had a lot of journalists, we have some good scholarships for these, do our certificate in Ed Finance March 30 and 31st this month. And what you would learn in that program is a lot of things like how to read a district's budget and who makes the decisions, what kinds of policies drive those decisions, but other things, including if you're going to report on finance, we recommend you do so in per pupil terms. There's just a piece that came out this morning I was reading that showed how much money, which districts were getting the most money, and not surprisingly, New York was getting more money because it's bigger, right? So New York and LA, it was just a list of districts by size, but there are some really interesting patterns in the federal money, like school districts that are getting more, even on a per pupil basis, that got lost if we're just going to talk about these mega budgets. So we teach people how to do all those kinds of things. So we invite you to participate in that. And if you're interested in school finance, when we get to the Q&A, I'm happy to answer any questions on that. So I will stop there and stop showing my screen. And we can move forward.
Thank you. Thank you. You said a lot in a little bit of time. I have lots and lots of questions. At the same time, I want to again remind everyone to submit your questions. This is for you. So we want to answer your questions. I can ask questions all day, but if you want particular questions answered, you're going to have to put them in the chat. So do so. Next, Daryl. So Edwin is always publishing analyses. Thank you, thank you. We all use them. But help us with some story ideas, some suggestions for looking at the school by school spending. Otherwise, my big question when I look at this is, don't we already know this stuff? Where are the stories that you'd point us to here?
Yeah, I actually came up with a presentation if I could. It takes like a couple of minutes. Yeah. All right. So if I could share my screen here. I titled this "Why Reporters Should Be as Hyped About as Researchers Are About School Spending," because last week I was or I guess it's early this week, I was in a session with Margaret Rosa, and I've done a lot of Zoom sessions this year, a whole bunch as everybody else. And this session had more than 150 people in it, and there were like 2 to 3 questions a minute. So I was like, why are researchers so much more excited about this than education reporters are? And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but I'm here to kind of hype us up a little bit. I see we have 50 people. Maybe you could triple the number of people in this session a year from now. So the first question I'll ask here is, does money matter? So politicians for the last half century have been saying it does not. And I think a lot of that rhetoric was kind of fueled by taxing and busing wars, school busing wars, but it was really based on faulty data. If you talk to a lot of school finance researchers, they'll talk about the fact that they had these limited data sets on how money was being distributed between states, between districts, between schools, et cetera. And there was a lot of analysis based off of, causation, which is faulty. And I will say that reporters, as education reporters, we are partly responsible for this myth, which was, as recently as a couple months ago, Betsy DeVos. You know, you hear politicians saying this all the time. We are spending way too much money. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't impact academic outcomes. But it has several implications, one of which that implies that academic problems lie with poor families and families of color. It implies that spending cuts and tax cuts won't impact academic outcomes. And it's resulted in an abbreviated, cramped conversation about how $750 billion is being distributed between schools. But researchers have concluded that it does actually matter. And I've talked to folks, you know, a whole bunch of researchers about this, and I've even gotten Eric Kanishek, who we quote all the time, saying it does not. Even he says that the research is compelling. It does matter. And they have also concluded that it matters the most for low-income students. So my proposal to education reporters is that we should start covering this like climate change. You know, climate change is happening. And once we accept that it's happening, then we can start asking the more difficult questions that I don't think we have answers to. So the newest research questions that researchers have that I think spark a whole bunch of story ideas, but I just think they're just really intriguing, and especially considering we're in this pandemic in which we've all seen that money can determine whether or not you can reopen your school or not. So when, where, and for who does money matter the most? How much should it cost to educate a child? What is equitable spending? We hear it all the time. Spending should be equitable. You will be surprised as to how many different definitions of equitable spending there are. Does a teacher's salary impact academic outcomes? How should academic intervention programs be funded, which is a new question that's being placed in research reports. And this is oftentimes because districts are taking up, you know, tutoring, they're taking up, you know, some sort of like reading program, et cetera, and they're not investing enough. They're investing too much, or they're not investing long enough. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about why the school spending data is just really so powerful, and I think why there's so much buzz around this in the research community. So we typically, and Dr. Rosa kind of went through this a little bit, we typically see district averages at mass disparities within districts. School board members and administrators make categorical decisions for a district rather than school-based decisions, and this is typically how we write about this, which I'll get into a little bit later. Most teachers are still paid based off a year's experience rather than talent. And new research shows that what happens within a school matters. So, you know, we all know about teachers, but there's new evidence that principals, that they matter tremendously. The type of academic intervention that occurs within schools matters, and school climate overall. So all the questions that school spending data is kind of like starting to get at, such as how much are you paying your teachers? What's the teacher turnover? How much are you spending on wraparound services, et cetera? This is a new clue and a significant clue into the answers to these questions. So how administrators recruit and attempt to retain these people matter. And one of the things that I just find so fascinating to me is, I think, I'm hoping that my screen, you guys can still see my screen here. Hopefully somebody will tell me if you can't. One of the things I find so fascinating is the fact that a lot of human resources folks don't talk to their HR professionals. So there's actually no intercommunication between how money is being spent and how much money you're paying folks. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how reporters traditionally write about money. We write about money regarding fiscal management, but not effectiveness. This is really where I see a lot of school finance stories. Is the money being spent legally? Is the money being spent ethically? They buy new couches for the administration building after they laid off a whole bunch of teachers. And the biggest question is a district on the brink of bankruptcy? Which all legit questions, but this has sort of limited CFO's role because they're just making sure you're not in the red this year. And we oftentimes focus on intra-district conflict rather than regional or statewide conflicts. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact where reporters are being assigned to cover. We're being asked to cover school boards. We're not being asked to cover state capitals or the Department of Education, but it implies that CFOs can fix everything, and implies that revenue problems are district generated. But the biggest sin that I think that reporters constantly commit is that we disentangle money from academic agendas. We've done several surveys, and one of the things that I always find surprising is that a quarter of administrators say their spending is not tied to their academic goals, which is really shocking. The fact that they're admitting this, because if a corporate CEO said that, heads would roll. So we don't include price tags on initiatives, and we don't examine whether revenue sourcing is adequate and sustainable. So we give a lot of fanfare to new initiatives, but we don't say how long this is going to last, or if they have enough money to make this last for at least 5 to 7 years, which is how long researchers have typically said initiatives require. So how school spending allows us to write about K-12 spending. School spending data allows for us to write about K-12 spending. So this allows for us to compare school spending across neighborhood, region, and states. And this is significant to me because I do think that oftentimes our lens is just so limited that we speak how much are they spending on reading and math this year, rather than how much is the region spending on schools in this neighborhood. It allows for us to examine sourcing of school revenue. And I think Marguerite can get a little bit more into this, but it does split, in most states, it does split between federal spending and state spending, state and local spending. And, you know, one of the things that the pandemic has taught a lot of districts is that spending or revenue can be very volatile depending on where it comes from. If it's coming from local dollars, it's very stable. If it's coming from state dollars, it's very volatile. It also allows for us to ask tougher questions about teacher salaries and turnover at schools. Everybody remembers the Red for Ed movement. One of the things that was happening within teacher Facebook groups was teachers were comparing their salaries between schools, and shocked to find out that even though some teachers, oftentimes they work at more difficult to teach at schools, they were getting paid significantly less. And that's a conversation that journalists should really be facilitating. It allows for us to examine whether spending is sustainable, predictable, and strategic. And that's sort of like, I'm kind of quoting folks here as to why when they think money matters the most. And allows for us to more heavily scrutinize federal, state, and district leaders about spending decisions. I mean, Marguerite kind of got at this a little bit, but in many instances, administrators are spending money. I would describe it as illegal, but oftentimes a better way to describe it is not as it was intended. And there's a whole backstory to why, you know, local leaders have as much flexibility as they do, but federal and state governments, they create these categories of spending, and oftentimes that money goes elsewhere. And it allows for us to examine state and district leaders' definition of equity. As I said before, lots of different definitions. When Dr. Rosa gave that chart, it allows for us to go to them and say, well, why are you spending more money on these kids and this kid? How is that equitable? So here are some story ideas. So our magnet schools, truly magnet schools. I mean, education reporters need to own up to some of the false myths we've created in the past. And one of those is that, well, the white and the black kids aren't getting along anymore, so the white kids just left. When in reality, oftentimes districts are strategically defunding magnet programs to the point that they are just as good, if not worse, than neighborhood schools. And there's really no incentive to attract folks into these schools. So the magnet school is basically, you know, inept. Is your district spending the most money on the most academically struggling schools? Dr. Rosa, who acted as my quasi-editor for a year, mentioned this as a story idea, and I just think that this creates all kinds of questions. I mean, you know, in many instances, a district will say, well, we are spending this much money on that school, and that is why they are getting the results that they are getting. That is an interesting answer. And sometimes they're saying, we just didn't know. Is the money being spent on the poor students, and how is it being spent on ELL, special education students, and students of color? One of the things that I do think that researchers have concluded is that some kids cost more than others because of their living conditions, because of their because of where they entered school, etc., because of the sorts of resources that are required. If you have a school that has a significant population of ELL, special education students, and there's significantly less spending at that school, then there are questions that you can ask administrators. And how do staffing models impact spending? And I'm really fascinated by the role of teacher aides, because there's so many of them and they're paid so little, I think like $8–9 an hour, that I just think that it just leads to a lot of questions as to, for a school that has a whole bunch of teacher aides and fewer teachers, is that spending equitable? And the one thing I would just say is just publishing the data on its own. We've been doing this with district spending for a long period of time. Publishing the data on its own, along with academic data, I think is an actual story in itself. Newspapers do it all the time. I think that we should venture into doing it in this arena too. And then I will just, one other idea is your district spending enough or not enough on overhead? And I would look at a statewide region too, because I think Marguerite can get a little bit more into this, but I think it does split out overhead costs. And this is all the myths around, we are spending way too much money on the superintendent and not enough on the classroom. So I'll just give a little plug to a story that we are getting ready to publish in like an hour or two, actually. We're thinking of headlines. But this is my story in Rochester, which has one of the worst performing schools in the state of New York. So they increased their spending from an average of like, $10,000 to $36,000 in a matter of 5 years. And when they did that, their academics rose dramatically. The academic outcomes rose dramatically. But I looked at, using the Edunomics data, I looked at the worst performing schools in 5 states identified under the federal law as and compared compared their spending to the average state spending, and there were a surprising number of schools that don't get even average amount of spending. So despite the fact that the story idea came from the way that reporters just went on and on and on 4 years ago, I think, when that study came out, saying all the Title I spending, all the SIG money was a waste.
So Daryl, I'm gonna interrupt you right here.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
You can't give away the whole story. You want people to come and see it, right?
I mean, they might not get to the end of the story, so I'm trying to, you're right, I should just tease them. Go to edweek.org. That's my presentation, so that's good.
Great, thank you so much. So yeah, I have a lot of questions. I'm going to start with Professor Rosa. Help us out here. I mean, we know that money matters. We wouldn't be in this webinar if it didn't, right? And the culture of America, American dream, if you're going to have a family, says get a home in the place that you can afford the best schools, and those are usually the best funded schools, right? Everybody wants to get into the best schools because we know the kids who need the most get the least amount of money. So what I want to know from you and your analysis and your database, what is this database telling us that we didn't already know? We haven't had school by school data, but what is it revealing that we didn't know about how we fund our schools?
So the district I showed you with all the bar charts, if you lived on one side of the district gives your school $4,000 more per pupil than if you went to a school on the other side of the district. This has nothing to do with revenues, because the district gets all its revenues from the state and local and federal sources, puts them into a bank account, and then it's the district that decides how much to give each school. By the way, next year, the district could choose to do the reverse, give more money to the other schools. So I think what I'm saying is, I think we've often thought once you've made it into a district, all things are good. But that ignores the fact that districts decide, should I give more money to this school or that school or this school? And we've seen some really profound patterns emerge in different districts, including in some suburban districts. And the one I showed you there, what is actually a suburban district. Money is also not the only factor. I think one of the reason the argument continues today about whether money matters is because it doesn't matter enough. That more money should bring greater returns for kids. And we all want it to, and it does some, but sometimes we put more money in and we're not seeing enough of an increase. And that's where I think you have the nuance in this equation. And we all, of course, we know we can put money into a school, and depending on how they spend it, it offers no real benefits for kids. So the money has to be spent thoughtfully, and it has to be spent in ways that are designed to get improvements for students. And that's the other side of this whole thing. That's what's new. We can decide, we can look in at school districts and see the choices that they're making about what they're going to do with the funds, and whether they spend them on more golf team activities, or more, and I only use that to kind of conjure up a stakeholder group that wants more money for themselves. I'm doing that to like be shorthand here, but whether we spend that money on adding more days of school for kids, or more hours of schooling, or maybe some resources that only benefit a small few, or evenly spread out for everybody when we really have a problem with achievement with a subset of our students. So those are all decisions that are happening inside districts, and that's what has nothing to do with which district you choose to take, to enroll your kids in.
Gotcha. So Daryl, you talked a little bit about how money is being spent, and asked whether, told us we should look at stories asking whether or not money is being spent on poor students, ELL students, etc. A lot of Ed Week reporting, a lot of reporting in general has pointed out that kids who need the most very often get the least resources invested into their educations in districts. Now that we have the school by school data, what do you expect is going to happen when these reporters that are listening join academic and funding data in stories? I mean, because we do stories to inform, but also for impact. What do you think could be the results of this reporting if we do it properly, joining the academic and funding data?
I just think it'll change the conversation. So many district administrators and state leaders tell us all the time, the way that money is distributed is way too complicated. Don't worry about it. And when we start asking these sorts of more critical questions, I'm looking here at the raw numbers, then these folks are going to have to come up with better answers than, well, it's their fault. And I think because K-12 spending is unique in the way that they get money from 3 levels of government. No other government agency in the country gets money the way that educators. It allows for a lot of finger pointing, and allows for a lot of dodging. And we know with school spending, it's explicit. This is school board members, CFOs, and superintendents who are making these decisions, and they will have to start explaining their decisions. And one thing I wanted to point out too, I think the big secret in K-12 spending is that they just roll over budgets from one year to the next. And now is a time to be asking this question, because COVID-19 requires for district administrators to upend their entire budget, because there's so many unusual costs, there's so many unusual things happening, enrollment is all over the place, etc. So now we can start asking what created these disparities within the district? Like, who's responsible for this?
Can I just add one little tidbit on that? It's such an important point, because one of the things, if you take my course, I start off with who decides how we spend all the money. And, I said it before, people say, oh, it must be the Secretary of Ed, or the Congress, or the state legislature, or the governor. And the answer, of course, is school boards. They do that when they sign their budget. And they obviously ask their superintendent and CFO to bring them a budget, and they can tweak it if they want, but then they sign it. Anyway, I one time asked a whole big, huge ballroom full of school board members, and I said, who decides? And they went, well, it's not us. And I went, no, you're actually the one, you're the group, you're the ones who makes that decision. And that's Daryl's point about we the school board members were like, we do? When did we do that? And I was like, remember that board meeting that you had where you approved the budget? That was the spending moment. And a board member has walked up to me after and said, that's funny because that just happened in our district. That was the last meeting. And we spent 2 hours on the gun lockers and 10 minutes on the budget. But there is this thing that we forget that these decisions are made. And even district leaders will say, well, hold on just a darn minute here. We're required with all these rules from the state and the federal government. And we'll say, stop for a second. You decided the pay scale in your district. You decided which teachers teach where. You decided how many teachers to have and how many reading coaches to have. You decided your athletic program. And they'll look around like, we did? And really what Daryl's saying is they took the one they got the previous year, but they fully have every right to make a change in that every year. And the not changing it is a decision, even if they don't remember doing it. And I don't think it's nefarious. I don't think they're, evil and everything else. They're swimming upstream on this. If, you try to change things in a city and people get very mad. But I do think exposing what we've been rolling over and choosing to do year after year is how we bring some more eyes to the table and make the spending moment a more deliberate moment.
Well, right now we're looking at $130 billion in federal funds being spent very soon on K-12 education. So it's a really important time to talk about money, not only because it always is important, but here comes a big bucket of money. And so a question for each of you is, first off, this data, this NERDS data, is it going to be updated anytime soon so that we might see either in real time or at least a year from now how that money was spent? and also, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so first of all, the data we have released right now is 18-19 data, and in some places we're getting 19-20 data. But what it can do is tell us which schools had less money going into the new federal windfall, right? So if you were the district I showed before in my slides, you've been shortchanging some of your highest poverty schools for a long time. Perhaps we need to think about that federal money in terms of not spending it in the same way we spend our money in the past, but actually really targeting it to certain schools. Now, here's a mistake. A lot of districts will say, what we'll do, we'll put a nurse in every school. Well, if your high poverty schools are twice as big and their wealthier schools are all these tiny small ones, you just put a disproportionate dollar investment in your smaller schools, and you may have just exacerbated inequities. So you really need to think about how that money is going to go out, and you have your old patterns to build on or to change. And that's what I think we want districts to do and to notice right away.
So, okay, tell me this. Go over a little bit about how this data came to be once more, and talk about whether, again, all of the state's data is in here. And I mean, because we're not used to getting school by school. I mean, the law says, they had to do it last year. Have all the states done it? Who's not doing it? And, is there resistance here? Because as we know, yeah, the feds have some leeway, but sometimes there's no stick. There's no punishment if states don't comply. So when we look at this data, are all the states cooperating? Where's the resistance? What do we do? Dr. Rosa?
Pennsylvania has data up right now. So if you've got Pennsylvania's the outlier right now, they have not complied. So that's the one that has not complied.
And if you're the education reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer or wherever, what do you do about that? Or what do the feds do about that? Are they going to get away with that?
Yeah, I think so. The deadline was June. We're a pandemic year, so some states took a little bit longer. California was the last of the ones that have reported, but they got the data up. But I think a story there, first of all, is that Pennsylvania doesn't have data up, right? And I do think that, the Department of Ed is in transition, and it is a federal law, and they could say, by the way, I'm not going to give you your Title I money because you didn't comply with other parts of the law. I don't expect that to happen right now in a pandemic, but I do think that clarity about this missed requirement helps create that pressure.
Can I also just add in here, when No Child Left Behind started in the early 2000s, I remember doing stories about how bad the academic data was. It was confusing, it was displayed poorly, and our editors were asking us to, they still do it today, sum it up and tell us how kids are doing the next day. And then reporters started doing more stories about how academic data is being displayed, holding officials accountable. These are decision makers at state departments and district leaders who are just not investing in displaying accurate, compelling finance data. Schools are the biggest taxers in states and in districts, and taxpayers deserve to know where that money is going. So it's really an accountability story.
Definitely accountability story. You also brought up a couple words that triggered me when you said adequacy and sustainability. Let's dig in a little there. Where are the stories? Because we could talk, academics and funding, but the conversation will inevitably get back to the question of, like you said earlier, how much should it cost to educate a child?
Right.
Are we going to get to that part of the conversation, or will we analyze these numbers to death and then the new numbers come out next year and we start over again?
Well, I think that it's how much it costs to educate a child is such a compelling question to me. And there are researchers out there who study this and come to legislatures every year and try to give a number that legislatures gawk at and say, let's figure out a way to spend less. I think this data provides a humongous clue into that question. And I do think that there is a real question about where we are spending too much. So I think oftentimes reporters we talk a lot about how there's not enough money to go around. Well, there are some districts that are, and you can see it in these numbers, that are spending $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a kid. I mean, really shocking numbers. And we need to be asking as administrators, why have you decided this? Why do we need to be spending this much money on these kids? Overspending is just as much of a story as underspending.
There you go.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm sure lots of questions have come in. Lori, you want to get us some questions from the audience? Can't hear you, Lori.
Yes, and I want to encourage our audience to keep their questions coming, and please include not just your name, but your affiliation as well when you ask your question. I want to start with a question of my own, though. The money breaks down, state and local spending versus federal spending. Are there any conclusions you're coming to, on where the federal dollars go and where the state and local dollars go?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. The federal dollars don't fund basic education. They don't fund like science class and math class and the principal and things like that. Those are out of state and local dollars. The federal money is supposed to layer on in specific ways that target needs. That's in a normal year without a pandemic. And so they're supposed to go layer on and bring up spending in high poverty schools, or be targeted specifically for students with disabilities, or to ELL, English language learner programs. So that's why when I showed our chart, we put the federal money on top, but you can see that the base amount is really not even across schools or even equitable across schools. And the federal dollars don't look like they're super intentional either. So both of those are stories to follow.
Great.
And by the way, the pandemic money, that's really flexible. They can use it for almost anything they want, and it's 100% worth paying attention to where it goes.
Yeah. Can you speculate based on what happened 10 years ago?
Anybody else having a hard time hearing Lori?
Lori, you're
During
freezing
the
up a
Great
little.
Recession. You know, 10 years ago, we had stimulus funding from the Great Recession to help schools get by during the Great Recession. What questions should reporters be asking based on the experience from that? You know, have the feds changed their strategies, or are they doing the same things over again
Race
with
to the
those
top.
dollars?
Yeah, I would. So I did a story about this at the beginning of the pandemic, and we're asking administrators that now. Marguerite can talk a little bit more about this, but like a lot of districts made a lot of financial errors because they were getting a flood of cash from the feds and they were getting state cuts at the same time, which can be very confusing. A lot of them kept their staffing in place, which led to drastic layoffs. We all remember the fiscal cliff that happened in 2012-13. A lot of money was not being used to, in this instance, like during the recession, we didn't really have a compelling reason to spend above and beyond. In this year, we have this compelling reason because we have all these kids who have either gone missing or have had sort of an abbreviated educational experience this past year and need extra. And what we are finding is that there are some administrators who are starting to talk about what does extra mean. Do we need to be doing summer school? Do we need to be doing tutoring services, et cetera? If your district is not having that kind of conversation, I have questions.
I'll add on that what also happened in the last recession was that districts used the money to fill budget holes, but they never really could afford to keep those things going. So let's say you're a district and you had promised some pay raises and you used the federal money to make good on those pay raises. When the federal money ran out, they had to lay off all these people because they couldn't afford the staff that they had brought on. And that was one of the issues. So the last recession was really just about a loss of money, though. This one is, as Daryl's saying, is got two things going on. You may be seeing some interruptions in your state money, and you need to use money to serve these kids better. But it's worth paying attention if you're a district to the long run. So if you've lost a lot of kids and they're not coming back, and you use your money to sustain an operation that is too big for the number of kids you have left, you're going to see what we call a fiscal cliff in a couple of years. So that's the sustainability part of this that could still exist for people. There's a lot more awareness of it this time. But if a district spends all its money in the first year and didn't, to maintain its infrastructure, probably going to have a cliff in a year or two from now.
Okay. All right, our first question comes from Julia McAvoy of KQED. She's noting that PTA money also has an impact on how much dollars each school has. It's definitely a gap in Oakland, California, for example. How much affluent parents are putting into fundraising for their kids in their own schools and not sharing that wealth with other schools. Obviously, that's not part of the school spending that.
Yeah, I think. I'm going to jump in on that because these journalists love to cover the private money angle. Just love to cover the private money at the exclusion of covering the public money. So in Oakland, there's $14,000 per pupil. Yes, there might be $100, even $50, $100, even $100 would be a lot in an affluent school to make through fundraising, because that would mean that every parent had chipped in at like $100 or more per student, and maybe it was even higher, $200 per pupil. Let's imagine a really expensive, wealthy area got $500 per pupil. We still have $14,000 in public funds. So let's not take our eye off the really big money. I think we can put that, just ask that people put it into perspective. Yes, it's an issue. Yes, it's a good story. It shouldn't come at the exclusion of spending time on the $14,000 per student in public funds.
Okay. Our next question comes from Sarah Johnson, and she asks, would a key driver of changes in the per school spending simply come from rethinking how schools are, or how teachers are assigned and who gets assigned to which school given how much money goes into teacher salaries? Can you talk about that and the potential challenges of making that happen?
Daryl, you want to do that one?
Yeah, this is a thorny, like when I first started writing about this, maybe 3 years ago, and I started asking CFOs about this requirement, it was the first time I had heard district administrators curse. F that, it's a stupid law, I mean, just really hostile. And oftentimes they said it's because the sole reason they're so hostile to this data is because it taps into the thorniest debate within education, which is teacher assignment. It's a very difficult thing for administrators to navigate. There's the whole world of there's a whole history around like why teacher assignments is such a thorny issue. But I do think that it's necessary for educators or education reporters to start asking these kind of critical questions, because who your teacher is matters, and how districts incentivize them both into the district and into a school matters. And I think this is where you start seeing a lot of these disparities in academic outcomes.
Well, and we do a big unit on that in our certificate in Ed Finance. And it also has a lot to do with teacher compensation systems. So should we be paying a senior teacher double the salary to do the same job as a junior teacher? And as long as we have that policy in practice and we make them the same job, like they both are going to teach 22 kids each, but we're going to pay one twice as much money, then we're going to get really lumpy salary patterns. I mean, the fact, a lot of times if you ask principals in high poverty schools, what do you think about these inequities? They'll say, yeah, we should do something. We would hire more senior teachers if we could, but they're all being drawn over to the other side of the district and taking the money with them. And now we have nothing to offer these teachers to come to our school. And so instead we have a revolving door of teachers. So the changes could be in how we compensate teachers. What should we ask more of senior teachers? If we're going to pay more, should we ask them to take on larger class sizes, more duties, that kind of thing? That would free up money for schools on the other side of town. And believe me, this is a hotly debated and not agreed upon part of the public education system, and we dig into that in our certificate, and it's actually really fun. We watch people change their mind and flip from side to side as they go through this issue. Anyway, it's not an obvious end decision for many people. Sorry, go ahead.
The other thing I would point out too is just the other thing to pay attention to is class sizes and the turnover rate for teachers. Those are two other elements that can impact the amount of money that's being spent at schools.
But every time we do a percentage raise, let's say we do a 5% pay raise in the district, we just sent more dollars, disproportionately more dollars to the schools that already had the senior teachers, because a percentage, it's not like saying every teacher gets a $2,000 raise. Some teachers are going to get a $4,000 raise. Some are going to get a much smaller one. And that more money is going to go to those schools that are already spending more. And so there are alternatives to this, but as long as we've kept these numbers hidden, we don't talk about solutions. And even if there are solutions. So that's why we're trying to, bring it up above board here.
Well, here's an interesting question. Do you foresee massive national litigation based on the NERDS data?
I think there could be some. We've had a hard time suing in federal court for inequities across districts. But district leaders, I think a community could sue and say that it's not fair that the district gives more money to one side of the town than the other. I don't know how successful it would be under current law. There are some federal provisions like Title I that are supposed to ensure a more equity across schools, but it certainly would put a spotlight on it. And many district leaders would like to make changes, but they don't have support in their community to move money around. And feeling the pressure of this from like a legal lens might be actually helpful for them. What do you think, Daryl?
I would just say that so there is a lot of litigation around school funding, and one of the things that this school spending data allows for is for you to go to a neighborhood that straddles two different districts, and you could start seeing some huge disparities between school spending. Because I think, Marguerite, you can correct me, but in most states you can compare school spending across the state. And that's where I think you can start seeing, okay, why does property tax matter so much? Why does it matter so much that, the state is not providing a sufficient amount of money on schools? Border stories are just always fun and interesting when it comes to school funding.
Great. We have another question from Julia on about Oakland is talking about more equity-based spending within the district. Schools that need the most help are getting more money. Is there any district that has implemented this kind of system, like Baltimore, for example? Do you know of any district that has tried to implement this?
Well, we do have a lot of large districts around the country that fund their schools based on the number and type of kids they have. Those are, we call them weighted student formula districts. San Francisco actually does that, but so does Denver, Houston, Baltimore City, Boston, and Chicago, and Indianapolis, and a few others. And what they do, in Atlanta's another one, is they say maybe everybody gets a dollar amount, every student gets some sort of dollar amount, plus an extra $2,000 for each student who's low income, or an extra $1,000 maybe for each ELL student. And so that you really are driving more dollars to schools with more high needs students. And that takes it out of the it takes it out of the district's decision of like, you can have this many staff and you can have that many staff, and it really funds schools based on students and student needs. And then individual schools have a little bit more say over the mix of resources that get used, that the money buys for them. So we are seeing more of that, and I expect that we'll see some of that when it comes to the federal money.
Great. Daryl, do you have anything to add?
No, I just think that even for districts in which they have a weighted student funding formula between schools, I do think that there's even more questioning for oftentimes, like, there are boards at schools that are making these decisions. So going to principals, I mean, this kind of brings up the fact that oftentimes principals don't know how much money is being spent in their schools. And I think that is one of the more fascinating conversations that I think is happening within districts right now. Once principals see this data, what is their response?
Right. I think we hear, we did a set of focus groups, and we interviewed principals all over the country and asked them how much money was spent in their school. And what they tended to quote was their sort of supply budget. And, the $42,000 we have for field trips and supplies, not all the money spent on all the labor in their building. And that meant that they didn't really almost see it. They could get more staff positions and not think they just got a greater investment in their school. So tightening up that link between what they see and realize is money and an investment, at the school level, I think would be really important. And I know we're getting near the top of the hour, but I do want to say that for those who think school finance is boring, Daryl has really shown in his coverage that it's not. It's the opposite of boring, and you can make it really come to life with the right sort of lens on that. We think it's, obviously I run a center that has we focus on ed finance, but we think it's where all the exciting information is. So if you're having trouble finding something interesting, feel free to reach out. I'm sure you've noticed something in your district that's exciting. It's literally like all the good stories are in ed finance. So I'll end with that. Daryl, would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it's
the money.
It's like seeing the underbelly of K-12 education. I mean, I think that it's one of the areas in K-12 in which there are not a lot of easy answers. Folks just don't know, and I think they're starting to probe into asking some of the more compelling questions that I think kind of gives reason as to why, again, seeing some of these disparities that we see with our own two eyes. So
I know Chastity agrees too, right, Chastity?
It's totally fascinating. I spent a whole year looking at this stuff, and it's sometimes it's hard to pick which story because there's so many.
Well, I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Chastity, Daryl, and Marguerite, and we appreciate you giving us your wisdom once more. For our audience, as soon as the webinar closes, you'll see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is important to us and helps us improve. And please join us in 6 weeks or so when we hold our national seminar. I'm sure money will come up there too. With that, I thank you again, guys, for a terrific presentation, and see you all at the next meeting.